So we published our initial round of regulations, and we really only had 3 items included therein. We defined what would constitute a family or personal relationship. This is going to be really important for these forward to a friend type campaigns. We provided the conditions for the use of unknown third-party consents. And we defined, in the terms of the non-business relationships, what membership in a club, association, or volunteer organization, basically all of these not-for-profit side of the equation, what would allow you to have that existing non-business relationship. I'll go into more detail on the family relationship and personal relationship and subsequent sides, but I won't really get into the unknown third-party consent. And the general rule for unknown third-party consent is, I'm here today, I say, we have partners we're going to partner with in the future. And I'd like to get your consent now to allow either myself or them to send you messages, special offers. In the law, we say that's all right. You don't know who you're partnering with, as Sean pointed out, 3, 4, 5 years from now. Once you get express consent, there's no time limit on it. So once people have opted in, consent is good until they opt out. So this can be a lengthy period of time, up to a decade. The issue with the unknown third-party consent is, if I'm going to allow this other party to send messages, and the consumer wants to unsubscribe, we have to be able to find a mechanism that he's either notifying me or I'm notifying him that this consumer is unsubscribed from the list, and that we got to take their name off of the list. So if we're at the end of the day, if we're sharing this list that we're both getting people to consent to, and I notify company B that I'm unsubscribing, well, he has to notify company A, and we have to make sure that every consent that is provided, when it's unsubscribed, you're unsubscribing from the entire list. So every consent provided, when it's unsubscribed, you have to give it effect. And that's the general rule for the unknown third-party consent. As I mentioned earlier, we received a lot of submissions from industry associations, and the concern was that our original definition of personal relationship did not account for virtual relationships. Basically, the first crack at defining personal relationship said you had to have met in person at some point in your lifetime, and that you have had to have some form of exchange, be it an electronic exchange over the past 2 years. Stakeholders thought that that was too limited, and they sought an expansion of the definition of personal relationship. A number of stakeholders also sought new exemptions from the consent requirements for specific types of messages, and I'll go into detail on all of these. And also the TSP and computer software industry sought new exemptions from the consent requirements, again, for the installation of computer software programs or computer programs under the Act in certain circumstances, and I'll go into detail on those. We have not, they did complain that, this unknown third-party issue was very complex, so if I build a list and I give it to somebody else, managing the unsubscribe process was too complex. And basically, the general rule under the law is, once I consent, I have to be offered the opportunity to no longer provide that consent in every message, be it company A or company B sending. So we made no changes to the unknown third-party regulation. And we have, and I'll go into more detail on this, a new exemption for what are called third-party referrals. In terms of the definition of personal relationship, again, we didn't provide enough space to recognize virtual relationships or the new online framework, so we have amended this definition of personal relationship and expanded it, and it's really based on a reasonability assumption now. So it means a relationship outside of a commercial relationship between an individual who sends the message and the person who receives it, that is direct, and the parties have had a two-way voluntary communication at some point. And it's reasonable to conclude, taking into account a number of factors, like we share interests, we're both part of a fly fishing newsletter group. We share opinions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've had communications over the past 10 years, or we have met in person. And again, this list is not exhaustive, so all of these issues can be taken into account. But it's reasonable to conclude that there is a personal relationship between these two individuals. there any questions about that? So that's personal relationship. Family relationship was also just clarified. It wasn't altered greatly. This one here was kind of easy. This was the easy one to fit in. So it's basically anybody that is related based on common grandparents and are related through blood, marriage, common law, which means that folks have been living together for a certain amount of time, or adoption. And the way the pyramid kind of works is starts at common grandparents, goes out to first cousins, and goes back down to grandchildren again. So you can't go within that one generation outside to second cousins or third cousins. That no longer qualifies as a family relationship. Both of these will be important, and Sean and I have talked before about the Forward to a Friend campaign, where you're asking people to forward on this commercial message or this offer to friends and family. You're going to need to add this kind of a caveat to say, look, when you're forwarding to friends and family, it's based on these two definitions. So, limit your sharing of this to those, and that's a way to kind of indemnify yourself from the potential liability in the future. Exemptions for specific classes of messages. Number of stakeholders talked about, we send a banking e-statement, and under a strict interpretation of the law, these could constitute a commercial electronic message. We also have already an exemption within the law under Section 6.6 for the sending of a warranty message or recall messages, et cetera, but we've added a new set of classes of messages from which the application of the law is going to be exempted. These will include business-to-business messaging, messages sent within a firm or corporation and between firms where the message relates to the context of the ongoing business relationship and there is a business relationship. These messages are exempted from the Act. There was an odd loophole in the legislation where we had exempted the request for information, so I'm sending you a request for information about your product, but we hadn't exempted the response to that request, and it didn't necessarily count as express consent. So now in our regulations, we're going to clearly state that messages that are sent in response to a request for information are exempted from the Act. Messages that are sent to enforce a legal right, debt collection, etc., are exempt from the application. And we had a foreigner roaming type issue. So what happens when a Brazilian company, for example, sends a message to a Brazilian who just happens to be in Canada for 6 months and is accessing all his messages while he's in Canada? Well, these are messages sent to Canada at this point, and the Act would come into play and cover these messages. Well, now we're exempting these messages because it would be impossible. It would not be reasonable for the company in Brazil to know that I'm sending to, bill@gmail.br a message. So it's no longer reasonable for us to assume or to expect that that business understands where they're sending the message, and those messages are exempt. So again, business-to-business exemption, clarification that employees, representatives of the firm, contractors, franchisees within a corporation sending to another business with whom we have an ongoing relationship, or within the firm where there's clearly a relationship, those messages are exempt as long as it refers to the person's business role or function. So just because I work in Apple doesn't mean I get to send Apple employees my Viagra campaign. And that's the general idea here, is as long as it relates to the people's business roles and functions, fine. Outside of that purview, you can once again get caught for spamming. Again, this one here was fairly straightforward, just closing up a loophole that we had in Section 6.5 in terms of responding to requests. Messages sent to enforce a legal right, debt collection, licensing information, in response to contractual obligations, in response to a court order, or the enforcement of a legal right are included, and it also includes things like a pending legal right. So you can send a message that says, as of January 1st, 2013, you are legally obligated to do the following. That we know that that's a pending legal right. That message is also exempt from the application of the law.
Yeah, just a quick question. So are they exempted from the law altogether, or just the exemption, the requirement for consent, or what's the nature of the exemption?
The exemption in these cases are under our provisions under 6.5, so they'll be treated the same way as personal or family relationships. So these messages are exempted completely from the application of the law. Therefore, the ID and unsubscribe requirements are not included.
I don't want to interrupt your presentation at this point in case we have an opportunity to visit this later, but I want to jump back just for a second to the unknown third party, and specifically on the unsubscribe portion of that. Is it limited to, is it both inward and outward propagation of the unsubscribe, or can it be just limited to the third party? What I'm getting at is you have a situation where you have unknown third parties. For instance, you may subscribe to Ford Motor Company, whatever, and one of their third parties comes up with some, protection for your paint or whatever. At some point, you may receive that and you go, I'm not interested in this garbage. So you want to unsubscribe from there, but you do not, and your intention is not to unsubscribe from Ford, who actually propagated that one, that particular third party out to you. So is there provision to allow the limitation of that, or does it, by unsubscribing to that paint protection, the client is unsubscribing to Ford also? So the question basically is, if I have a list that I've built and I've got unknown third parties who are also using the list, when it comes to the unsubscribe, is there an opportunity for it to be a little bit more granular? So yes, I want to hear about the hotel offers, but I'm not interested in the airline tickets and I'm not interested in the car rental, for example. The opportunity is there to let you go into that level of granularity in terms of the unsubscribe. The minimum requirement, the minimum is that I gave you consent, you have to offer up the opportunity to unsubscribe. But then if you have a large program where there are a number of items listed off, and I don't want to hear about the book and magazine specials, but I do want to continue to get the airline specials, you can offer that level of granularity in terms of the unsubscribe mechanism. Yeah, but that's you, that's Ford. But what about that third party? When that third party sends me that newsletter, is my unsubscribe, or is the unsubscribe only going to be applicable to them, or is it the onus on them then to go back to who they received that from and say, yeah, you got to unsubscribe this guy?
The onus is on them, because now they're using, let's say I'm sending using a consent that you got from some other individual. I'm using that consent. If I'm providing an unsubscribe over here, and the person chooses to unsubscribe from future mailings, well, if we didn't offer this level of granularity to say, my company has to give you the unsubscribe, but maybe you don't have to unsubscribe from Bill's company over here. If I haven't given that, the unsubscribe is given effect to all the companies that are using that same one list, because there's only the one consent. So you have to unsubscribe completely across the board. And it's the responsibility of either company. Both companies are liable. If I'm using your consent, person unsubscribes, I have to notify you, we got to get that person off the list.
Okay, so then in this case, the third party, the paint protection company, they're going to have to know where my list, which list I came from to push it back.
That's right. You'll have to know, and I mean the easy equation for this is if I'm going to gather a list and I'm going to share and allow other parties to send, I may still want to manage the unsubscribe myself over here, so that the unsubscribe link at the bottom of the email goes back to my unsubscribe list, so that I can control who's using or not using the list. The other option is that, yeah, I've got permission for unknown third parties, but I'm going to control the sending mechanism so that the unsubscribe requests are coming back to me. We had another question.
Thanks. Just quickly to follow up on what Bill said, I think this is a data protection issue anyway, because as you said, only the one who has got the consent can actually send and use your personal data to send out their emails. So you have to unsubscribe at this party, the paint manufacturer or whatever, who is actually using the data. Either they have the right to do that or they don't. If they don't have the right, you don't have to unsubscribe. You can directly go and use the CASL. If they do, and you said they are using the consent somebody else obtained, I think that is maybe confusing because they can't use that consent. They either have the consent or they don't. If they are sending through a Ford Motor Company, for example, they will never see actually the personal data, Bill's personal data. They are just saying, okay, I actually give my consent to Ford Motor Company to send me emails, but what the content of the email is a completely different question, of course. So you don't have to unsubscribe at the paint manufacturer there, but you have to tell Ford Motor Company, as you say, that you don't want to have their newsletter anymore because there's too much crap paint manufacturer ads inside, you know. So you can only actually unsubscribe there where you have given the consent. If you don't have, if you don't give the consent, no need to unsubscribe.
And we always thought that there would be a measure of self-policing. I mean, a list is only as valuable as the number of subscribers I've got on it, the number of subscribers I can keep on it. So we always understood that there would be, you know, a level of self-policing in terms of this space as there was. So we didn't become overly prescriptive with this, but the baseline rule is anybody who gave consent to receive a commercial message must be able to withdraw it in every message that is sent using that consent. That's the easiest way I know how to describe that. I think Bill's got a follow-up.
I'm just going to move over here.
Sorry, just one more little piece of that. In the case of the third party then, is there any requirement for them to indicate as to where they received the source or why that individual is getting it? Because that would go to add a lot of clarity for the individual.
Again, not a requirement, but a best practice. And, you know, it's not a requirement under the CRTC rules or under the law itself, but a best practice is very clear. Remind people that they've consented to receiving these messages from whatever company is sending them should usually be right up front. You'll get less people opting out from the list if they know. Because if you get some odd message from, you know, some rental car company that you've never heard of, and they don't know that you consented to the Air Miles group or whatever it is over in this side, they're going to unsubscribe and then not even know that they're unsubscribing from their air, you know, their air group list. So that becomes the issue. I've already described, to some extent, the foreigner to a foreigner messages, so I'll move on quickly to exemptions for the installation of computer programs. There are 2 exemptions that we've added for the installation. TSP stands for Telecommunication Service Provider, defined very broadly within the legislation, likely to include, in some cases, ESPs or ISPs. But if they have to install something to a computer that is not necessarily on their network, or even if it is on their network and they're not covered by this installation under their terms of use, if they're installing the program to protect the network from some kind of a security breach or attack, that installation is exempt from the consent requirements under the Act. Any questions about that?
Not a question, but I really don't like giving the rights to anybody to install stuff on my computer without my knowledge. I think it opens the doorway to issues.
We took that into account, and again, this is limited, and the onus is on the TSP to prove that they are giving effect to this install in order to protect the network. So if you don't like the fact that these guys are installing something, like the large telecommunication service providers installing something on your computer, they have to, and you can complain to the CRTC or to the government about it, they have to, the onus is on them to prove that this was done solely for the purposes of protecting the network.
I may never know about it. It sounds like it's a Trojan to me.
We were cognizant of the fact that we were opening up this back door, but at the same time, if Major TSPs have people hacking in, and the only way that we couldn't hold them liable for just trying to defend themselves, and the only way to defend themselves from a DDoS or a bot attack was to go out and install on that computing system on the other side. And again, computer programs is defined very broadly, and computing systems is defined very broadly. We had to provide that allowance for a TSP to do it. But again, the onus is on them to prove that they had a legitimate reason for doing it. And I doubt that there'll be too many major service providers who'll be doing this, running the risk. Again, we get back to the self-policing. If they're doing it for less than straightforward reasons, they're running the risk again of class action lawsuit, private right of action, or CRTC enforcement with significant penalties. So the backdoor is, if you're not doing this to protect the network and you're just trying to go in and scope out, other account users' information or whatever, you're running the risk of being on the wrong side of this. The other question we got from service providers, because we had defined computing systems and computing programs so broadly, was what happens when I have to do an update to my network across the entire network simultaneously. So an example of this would be a TV set-top box, where we're going to change the interface, the user guide interface for that. Now that would be considered likely a computing system and a computing program installation in terms of the law, but the only way that it would function is if they do it across all of the set-top boxes at one time. They can't wait. If they have 600,000 users, they can't wait and get consent. What happens if somebody's moved out of the country for 6 months and they've got to wait to give effect to this installation? So we provided an exemption for that type of activity where it's done across the entire network, and we allow for those software installs to be completed without consent. So again, this one just goes into more detail about the TSP or ISP installation of a computer program for the purpose of preventing illegal activities that present a risk to the network, or on a network-wide basis for updates and upgrades. The consent provision, again, for the unknown third parties, I think we've talked about this, so I'm just going to skip the slide, but the information is going to be here. This is another new exemption from the consent requirements within the legislation. However, the identification and unsub requirements are still included in these, so these are not a complete exemption from the Act, but rather just an exemption solely from the consent requirements. And these allow for one individual to refer another individual. So I want to refer Bill to Sean's legal offerings. I can allow Sean to send a message directly to Bill. And here's how the framework's going to work. The individual who sends the message, in this case being Sean, discloses in the message my ordinary or full name. So I got your information, Bill, from André Leduc. Sean and I have to have a family, personal, existing business, or existing non-business relationship. And Bill and I have to have the personal, family, existing business, or existing non-business relationship to allow that message to be sent. What happened when we published the regulations, a lot of professional direct sellers, lawyers, financial advisors, real estate agents, insurance brokers were concerned that this is one of the main ways that they do business, and that we would limit that direct contact with prospective clients in future. So they wanted an allowance for this. What we said originally, and why it's coming out kind of late in the game, is what we said originally is, well, you can pretty much do this already in the Act. What would stop me? Under the legislation, there's nothing in there that would stop me knowing I have a relationship with Bill and I have a relationship with Sean from sending the two of them an email simultaneously and saying, Bill, if you want to get Sean service, here's his email, here's his contact info, go to it. There were a number of lawful ways that people could act on third-party referrals within the legislation without requiring this exemption. But at the end of the day, we made the decision to go ahead with this exemption because it is such a common use, and it didn't really open up a loophole for abuse by scammers and spammers. So this is basically the way that the system works. The other caveat is it only permits the sending of a single message. So you don't get to send a message, another message, another message, and basically pester the person. You get to send one message. You have to identify the person who provided the referral by full or ordinary name. And the party that provides the referral and the party, the individual to whom the message is sent, those require those personal, family existing, or existing non-business relationships to be in place. And that is the end. I'll leave that one up there because it's kind of a complicated exemption from the legislation, but it's really an allowance for those direct one-to-one sellers in professional markets for the most part.